of want to cover everything or review everything that we've covered up to this point. I want to make sure that as we're going so in depth in the book of Revelation that we don't lose sight of the big picture. And I think sometimes we have the tendency to do that, especially when we go verse by verse. So we're going to just kind of do a review up to where we've already covered. Now, believe it or not, the book of Revelation is really not that difficult to understand. I know people think that it is, but it's not. In fact, I've broken it all down into what I consider to be a very simple chart. Now, my chart is a modification of Clarence Larkin's chart. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to review by going through this chart and showing you the chronological order of each event up to the last part of chapter 14, because that's where we stopped last week. And then when we finish the 7 vials in a few months, it's going to take about a couple of months to get through that, we're going to do this process again. And the reason I want to do this is because I want you to be able to pull out your chart, and I want you to actually go through the book of Revelation and understand the big picture. So hopefully you brought your chart. Did you bring your chart? People say, no, I don't do that anymore. Well, you really need to do that, especially as we're going through it, because what I really want you to do is I want you to take notes on the chart to help you understand all of these events and how it fits into God's timeline. Now, I know some of you don't like writing on your chart because you're afraid then that it's not going to look pretty. Well, we sell new charts. You can buy a new chart for $1 in the bookstore. So go ahead and just write all over your chart. Take all the notes that you need to so that you can actually flip to this chart when you're studying or going through the book of Revelation and understand what's going on and how each event fits into God's timeline. Now, in chapter 1, verse number 19, John was instructed to write the things which thou hast seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. Now, this is the basic outline of the book of Revelation. You see, the book of Revelation is divided into 3 sections. The things which thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. In other words, past, present, and future. The things thou hast seen refers to the vision that John had of Jesus in chapter 1. You see, John had a revelation of Jesus as he is now in heaven, not as he was when he walked upon the earth. You see, John was one of Jesus' disciples, so he knew Jesus. He had this revelation of who Jesus was, but when he had a vision of Jesus in heaven, he was totally different than what he was familiar with. And that revelation of Jesus is recorded in chapter 1. So chapter 1 is a record of the things that John has seen. The things which are refers to the church age, chapters 2 and 3. Each church that's mentioned in chapters 2 and 3 represent a period of church history. The church of Ephesus represents the apostolic period. It went from 30 to 100 AD. The church of Smyrna represents the persecuted period. Now, let me just make a few comments here. If I were you, I would write over, wrong one. I would write over Ephesus, the apostolic period. I would write over Smyrna, the persecuted period. So in a year or two, you don't forget what each church represents when it comes to church history. The church of Pergamos represents the church-state period. That's when Constantine legalized Christianity, and he allowed the church, or I should say Christianity, to become the official religion of the state, the Roman Empire. The church of Thyatira represents the papacy period. In other words, the establishment of the Pope. So what we have here, in a sense, is the advent or the origin of the Catholic Church. And that ran from 590 to 1517 AD. The church of Sardis represents the Reformation period. That began in 1517 and went to 1790 AD. The church of Philadelphia represents the revival period. And what do I mean, the revival period? This is also known as the Great Awakening. This is when you had these great evangelists, and they went all over, and thousands of people would come to outdoor meetings, and they would almost all get saved. There was a great revival that took place. And as a result of this great revival, there was also a lot of missionaries that were sent out. So sometimes scholars refer to this as the missionary period. And then you have the church of Laodicea. It represents the apostasy period. That's from 1900 to the present. Around 1900, we started to see this liberal movement go through the church. In fact, if you go to the majority of the seminaries today, they are liberal seminaries. They don't believe that Jesus was truly resurrected. They believe in what is called neo-orthodox theology, where Jesus is resurrected in your heart. They don't believe in the miraculous things that took place. In fact, what they try to do is they try to explain all of these miracles from a scientific perception or viewpoint. And that's what we have today. Now, whenever a new church period began, it doesn't mean that the churches from the previous period ceased to exist. Let me give you a couple of examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. The Catholic Church still exists today, but in 1517, the Reformation period began, and Protestant churches came into being. In fact, the word Protestant actually comes from the word protest. These were people who were protesting the practices of the Catholic Church. And the reason it's called the Reformation movement is because they originally wanted to reform the Catholic Church. They did not want to separate. But when the Catholic Church refused to reform, then they actually left the church. They protested and they went out and they began Protestant denominations. Now, these Protestant churches are in existence today. But that doesn't mean that the Catholic Church has ever ceased to exist. And that's my point. Even though the Reformation period was a new period in church history, it doesn't mean that churches from the previous period or periods ceased to exist. Let me give you another example. In 313 AD, Constantine legalized Christianity, as I said, and it became the official religion of the state. And as a result, the persecutions of Christians, it actually ceased in the Roman Empire. But that doesn't mean that Christian churches or Christian people aren't being martyred today, aren't being persecuted. You can go to many nations in the world today, and the church is being persecuted. So as I said, whenever a new church period begins, it doesn't mean that churches from the previous period or periods cease to exist. Does that make sense? Good. So which period are we in now? We're in the last period, the Laodicean period. Now let me ask you this. Is there going to be another church period before Jesus Christ returns? No. The last period is now. We are the last period before Jesus Christ returns. That should tell you how close it is. Now, the things which shall be hereafter. See the titles I have at the top, the things thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. That refers to the future events that are going to occur when the church age ends. And when does the church age end? When the rapture occurs. In chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, John was raptured. In other words, he was taken to heaven. And his rapture represents the rapture of the church. So chapter 4 is a vision of heaven with the church around God's throne. Now, chapter 5 gets the ball rolling. Jesus takes the scroll that's sealed with 7 seals from God's right hand. The scroll is the title deed to earth. And in chapter 6, Jesus begins to open the seals one by one. When the first seal is opened, a rider on a white horse appears. This is the Antichrist. He's riding a white horse because when he first comes on the scene, he negotiates a 7-year peace treaty with Israel. White represents peace. So if I were you, right above the white horseman, I would actually say, this is the Antichrist. He's going to negotiate a 7-year peace treaty. When the second seal is opened, a rider on the red horse appears. This rider ushers in World War III. Ezekiel's chapter 38 and 39 detail the events of this war. In fact, it's kind of interesting, but a lot of people actually try to make the battle that's described in Ezekiel 38 and 39 to be the Battle of Armageddon, but it can't be. Because basically it says that Israel is dwelling safely in its land. Well, when is that going to occur? That's going to occur shortly after the 7-year peace treaty. The Israelites are going to take such stock in what the Antichrist does when he first comes on the scene that they're going to let their guard down. And that's when this battle is going to occur. When the third seal is opened, a rider on a black horse appears. This rider brings famine upon the world. Now, famine is an after effect of World War III. When the fourth seal is broken, the last horseman is unleashed upon the world. This pale rider brings death with him, and a quarter of the earth's population dies. Now, if you do some quick figuring, you'll come up with about 1.4 billion people. That's how many people are going to die, and you're just in the first few months, maybe the first year of the tribulation. These four horsemen bring deceit, destruction, and devastation upon the world. You might say that the four horsemen of the apocalypse actually kick off the tribulation. They get it all started. In fact, when you see the first horseman come upon the scene, the tribulation has begun. And by the time the fourth horseman comes on the scene, the tribulation is in full swing. Nothing can stop it now. It's already been set in motion. And let me just go ahead and go a little bit further and say, nothing can stop it anyway. God said this is the way it's going to be, and this is the way it's going to be. Now, when the fifth seal is opened, you see some of the first martyrs in heaven. You don't see a lot, you just see a few. We're going to see that escalate as we come to the middle of the tribulation, and then it's going to hit its peak right after the middle of the tribulation, after that second half begins. Now, when the sixth seal is opened, a polar axis shift occurs. In fact, this is kind of interesting, and you really don't understand it unless you actually translate it from the original Greek. John describes it in this manner. He says that the heavens split like a scroll. And what he's describing is a split scroll, not one that's just one, but it's actually two. And then he says this, and the heavens rolled. Now let me explain. In fact, let me just turn this around, if you don't mind, to look like this. This is a split scroll, and he says this is what the heavens look like, except it was rolled out. And then it says that the heavens rolled. Now, when you take a scroll like this and roll it, what you do is you roll one side out, you roll the other side in. And if you go the other way, as you roll this out, you roll this side in. But what's interesting is, what's behind this as it's rolled is now revealed, and what's revealed is actually closed. And John says this is actually what the sky or the heavens does when the sixth seal is opened. Now, the only thing that could cause that to occur is a polar axis shift. And that's what occurs. Chapter 7 is an interlude. In other words, it interrupts the chronological flow of events in order to give you vital information that you need to know. You see, after the death of over 1.4 billion people in a short period of time, in about a 1.5 to 2 year period, then you have this polar axis shift. Everyone thinks that it's the end of the world, but it's not. In fact, we're not even to the midpoint of the tribulation. We're not even close to getting there yet. So the question is asked at the end of chapter 6, the great day of his wrath has come, and who shall be able to stand? In other words, if this is the wrath of God, and it's going to get worse before it's over, who can survive it? And people, that's a pretty good question. So the natural flow of events is actually interrupted in order to answer that particular question. And that's what chapter 7 is all about. In the first 8 verses of chapter 7, we find out that shortly after the rapture, 144,000 Jews will realize that Jesus was the Messiah, and they will receive him as their Savior and Lord. So when you get to chapter 7, it says 144,000 sealed. If I were you, I'd make a little note there. Right after the rapture occurs, that's when these 144,000 are going to recognize that Jesus was the Messiah, and they're going to become lean, mean preaching machines. Now, because they missed the rapture, they're going to have to go through the tribulation, which is a time when God's wrath is going to be poured out upon the earth. So the 144,000 are going to be sealed on their foreheads with God's name in order to protect them from the wrath of God. Now, let me give an example of that. A little further on in the judgments, in the trumpet judgments, we're going to see demonic locusts loosed or released from the abyss. They're going to have the ability to sting like a scorpion. But here's what's interesting. They sting everyone but those who have been sealed on their forehead. So the 144,000 are going to be sealed by God in order to protect them from the wrath of God. But that does not mean that they're going to be protected from the Antichrist. They're going to be protected from the supernatural, but not from the natural. So these 144,000 Jews are going to be martyred for Jesus Christ. Now let me ask you something. Why are they going to be protected from the wrath of God? The reason they're going to be protected from the wrath of God is because of Jesus. If you remember when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus said this prayer to God. He said, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. That word cup refers to the wrath of God. If you remember last week when we were studying the wrath of God, what did he liken it to? He likened it to a cup of wine. And he said, I'm going to make the wicked drink it. And what was that cup of wine? That was his wrath. Now, what Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he said, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, he was saying, God, if it be possible, let your wrath pass from me. I don't want to have to endure it. I don't want to have to go to the cross. I don't want to have to die on the cross. I don't want to have to go to hell. If there's any other way, God, then let that happen. But there was no other way. So Jesus said, nevertheless, not my will, but yours. And so what Jesus did is he suffered the wrath of God. And because he suffered the wrath of God for us, we don't have to. That's why the church is going to be raptured before the wrath of God occurs. But those who get saved after the rapture, they missed it. And because they missed it, they're going to have to go through the tribulation. So these 144,000 are going to be sealed because they believe in Jesus. And the interesting thing is, it says that when these demonic locusts come out, they will sting everyone except those who have the seal, the mark of God on their forehead. Now, it doesn't say except the 144,000. Why? Because I believe that those who become saved during the tribulation are going to be sealed like the 144,000. He just brings up the 144,000 because they are an elite group of men who are going to preach the gospel all over the world. Now, when the seventh seal is opened, the 7 trumpet judgments begin. And it's kind of an interesting thing because it's this 30-minute of silence, and we kind of went through that, and we saw that the angel actually took the golden censer. He went to the altar, and he took the coals and the fire from it, and he flung it to the earth. And why did he do that? Because that symbolized that now God's wrath is going to be poured out upon the earth. So when the first trumpet is blown, hell and fire mingled with blood hits the earth, and 1/3 of the earth is burned up. 1/3 of the trees are destroyed, and all of the grass is burned. So if I were you on your chart, when it comes and it talks about the first trumpet, I would write down 1/3 of the trees are destroyed, and all of the grass is burned up. When the second trumpet is blown, a volcano erupts, and the top of the volcano is thrown into the sea. The Bible describes it as a burning mountain cast into the sea. And as a result of that, 1/3 of the oceans turn to blood. And 1/3 of the creatures, or the sea creatures, I should say, die. And 1/3 of the ships sink. Now, this is a natural disaster such as the world has never seen before. When the third trumpet is blown, a huge asteroid actually hits the earth. And it contaminates 1/3 of the rivers and 1/3 of the springs. So 1/3 of all the fresh water is contaminated. Now, if I were you and you missed the rapture, I would actually buy puts on these companies that own these type of things. Or I would buy calls or do whatever in your stock, and you can become a millionaire. You're going to have to suffer. Go ahead and make some money. That'll help you a little bit. But then we're going to find out you're not going to be able to spend it anyway. So you might have some insight on what's going to happen, but it's not going to matter. Now, when the fourth trumpet blows, the heavenly bodies are hit with the plague. And this is very interesting because it says that 1/3 of every heavenly body quits giving light. And it doesn't mean that if you count all of the stars and the sun and the moon, 1/3 of them is going to be hit with the plague. No. It means that every star, every planet, the sun, the moon, all the moons around the other planets, they're all going to be hit with the plague, and 1/3 of them will quit giving light. Now, a third part of each of the bodies will quit giving light. And it's interesting because when you translate this from the original Greek, what it's telling us is that a third of the daylight period will actually be darkness. And let me see if I can explain what this means. Let's suppose that the sun comes up at 6 o'clock in the morning and it goes down at 9 o'clock in the evening. That's a period of 15 hours, is that right? So a third of 15 hours is 5 hours. So at a time when the Earth should have 15 hours of daylight, it only has 10. And during 5 of its hours, it's pitch dark. And then it's the same thing for at night, where you usually have the moon shining. And so if it's a full moon out there, and maybe the full moon would be there for 8 hours, or if it's 15 hours, that would be 9 hours. But for a third of that, 3 of the hours, it's pitch dark. For some reason, the moon doesn't shine. And you know that it has to be supernatural because there's really no way to explain this. When the fifth trumpet blows, supernatural locusts that are demon-possessed actually come out of the abyss. And as I said, they possess the ability to sting like scorpions. And for 5 months, they sting everyone who does not have the seal of God on his forehead. Now, they don't have the ability to kill, but they have the ability to inflict excruciating pain upon people to the point that people want to die. When the sixth trumpet is blown, an army from the east actually invades the west. If you notice, it says 200 million, I believe it says 200 million soldiers. But anyways, as we look at 200 million soldiers, the only one that could possibly do that in our time period is the Chinese army. It says that this army is going to kill a third of the population. Now, if you don't mind, let's try and figure out how many people are going to die as a result of this trumpet judgment. The population of the world today is 6.7 billion. And that, of course, was of October 2008. That's when I was kind of teaching on this. Didn't have time to get on Wikipedia and look for it now, so we'll just keep 6.7 billion people. Now, let's suppose that 1 billion people are raptured. I think that's been quite generous, don't you? That would leave 5.7 billion people on the world, or I should say on the earth, in order to face the tribulation. Now, if you remember, a fourth of the population is going to die during the first 4 seals of the tribulation. That means that 1.4 billion people are going to die. That leaves the world with a population of 4.3 billion. And of course, let's be honest, more people are going to be killed during the first 4 trumpet judgments. I mean, think about that. When that asteroid hits the earth and it contaminates a third of the fresh water, we talked about this. You're danged if you do and you're danged if you don't. If you don't drink the water, you're going to die. If you drink the water, you're going to die. It's just going to take longer to die because it's contaminated. It's poisoned. So we're going to see a lot of people die over that. When the volcano erupts and the burning mountain goes in the sea and it turns it red and a third of the sea creatures die. It also says a third of the ships sink. When that takes place, we know that people are going to die. But let's not take any of that into consideration. Let's just say that the world now has a population of 4.3 billion. All right? 1/3 of 4.3 billion people is 1.4 billion people. Now, people, we started off with 5.7. By the time the sixth trumpet judgment occurs, almost half of the population has already died. 2.8 billion people. And we're not quite halfway through the tribulation. We're not even at the middle yet. We're almost there. Now, between the sixth and the seventh trumpet, we have another interlude. This is more parenthetical information. If you remember, and this is kind of an interesting chapter, in chapter 10, an archangel who's acting as a proxy for Jesus serves a judgment summons. In other words, Jesus is going to begin the eviction process of Satan and his followers. So this angel actually comes to the earth and he places 1 foot on the earth and 1 foot on the ocean. And then he raises his right hand and he actually takes an oath, just like we do in a court of law. And he swears by God that time is up. In other words, it is time to start the eviction process so Jesus can take possession of the earth. It's time for the kingdoms of this world to now become the kingdom of our God and of our Lord. Now, let me see if I can break this down and make it very simple. The first half of the tribulation is actually where Jesus takes the title deed to earth and he begins to open up the seals. And remember, the seventh seal starts the seven judgments, or seven trumpet judgments. So basically, this is just where Jesus takes his intention. He takes the title deed to earth and he says, I am going to do it. But the second half of the tribulation is the literal eviction process. That's why everything escalates. This is why Satan knows, and I'm jumping ahead of myself, when he gets kicked out of heaven, he has only but a short time. Why? Because up until this time, Jesus has the title deed to earth. He's opening these things up, and it's coming all the way up to here, but he hasn't started the eviction process. But once this angel comes down and places his foot on the earth and his foot on the ocean, and he takes an oath and he says, no more time. In other words, time is up. What he means is it's now time to start the eviction process. Satan and his followers must go. And of course, Satan is going to fight this the whole way. So when the seventh angel blows his trumpet, it means no more delays. Time is up. The second half of the tribulation begins, which means the eviction process has begun. And then the angel does something strange. He takes this book and he hands it to John and he tells him to eat it. And so John eats it. And when he first eats it, it's sweet. But then after a while, it becomes bitter in his belly. Now, we need to remember that eat is a Hebrew idiom. It means to consume knowledge by reading and studying. And we use the same figure of speech today. When a person is really interested in a subject, what will he do? Well, he'll read a lot about it, and he'll actually start studying on the subject. And many times you'll hear a person say, well, I just really ate that up. I loved it. So what this is saying is that when John first reads this book about what's going to happen in the second half of the tribulation, he thinks, this is great. It's sweet. Finally, Satan and his followers are going to be evicted from earth, and the kingdom of God is going to come to the earth, and the kingdom of heaven is going to be established, and we're going to have this millennial reign. This is great. But then when he begins to understand the price that's going to be paid in order to do this, it turns his stomach. It becomes bitter because he realizes no matter how bad the first half of the tribulation was, it's nothing compared to the second half of the tribulation. Now, chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14 are also interludes. They're parenthetical information because other things were happening, were going on as the first seals and the trumpets were happening. And then things happen at the middle of the tribulation that you need to understand before we proceed on to the last half of the tribulation. So he's going to give us all of this information in chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. So in chapter 11, we find out that the temple was built at the beginning of the tribulation. Now here's what's kind of interesting. Scholars have always taught that in order for the third temple to be built, that the Dome of the Rock would have to be destroyed. And I can't tell you for the last 40 years how many preachers have preached that they don't know how, but somehow that Dome of the Rock is going to be gone. But what's kind of interesting is if you read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 11, it tells John not to measure the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. And he tells him why. He says, for the Gentiles are going to trample it down. A concession is going to be made in order for the Jews to be able to rebuild the temple. And he tells us this in the first two verses of chapter 11. And the concession is this: the Dome of the Rock will be able to remain on the Temple Mount. Now, scholars have always said they can't, because the temple has to be built exactly where the Dome of the Rock is. But people, that's not true. In fact, this last time that I was in Israel, we actually went to the Eastern Gate, also known as the Golden Gate. That is the gate that the Messiah is going to come in on. That's the gate that Jesus is going to enter. And it was kind of funny because the Jews are also looking, because they don't accept Jesus Christ, for another Messiah to come. They're looking for the Messiah to come. And because it says he's going to come through the Eastern Gate, there were actually 3 Orthodox Jews that were there. I was over at Israel during the Feast of Pentecost, and so you wouldn't believe how busy the old city was. And what was interesting is these 3 Jews, and usually Orthodox Jews will not go up to the Temple Mount. And most of the rabbis will tell them not to do that because you might step on something that's holy and you just can't do that. But these 3 came up, and I watched how they walked around. They went to the Eastern Gate, and it's padlocked. on the inside. It's also rocked up, but on the inside it's padlocked. And what was interesting is they had a camera, and they were acting like they were opening up, and they were having people take pictures of them because they're looking for the Messiah. But the interesting thing is, we know that the temple actually was built perpendicular to the eastern gate. But they thought that when the Turks came in and rebuilt the outer wall that they moved the gate over. But archaeologists are beginning to believe that that didn't happen because they've been able to go underneath and they found out that the foundation for the eastern gate is exactly where the eastern gate is now. And if you go to the eastern gate and you look perpendicular, there is plenty of room to build the third temple. And I believe that's what's going to happen. But we do know from chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, a temple is going to be built. We're also told that God is going to send two prophets at the beginning of the tribulation. He calls them the two witnesses. They will prophesy for 1,260 days in Jerusalem. Now, when the 1,260 days are up, which will be at the middle of the tribulation, they're going to be killed by the Antichrist. They're going to lie in the street for 3.5 days. And it says that the eyes of the world will be watching them. Well, with satellite TV, the internet, it's kind of interesting. Things were coming out of Iran that people couldn't believe, out of Twitter, YouTube, cell phones. The world's going to be able to see these two witnesses as they lie on the streets. But at the end of the 3.5 days, they're going to come back to life, and they're going to be taken up to heaven in view of everyone. The two prophets are none other than Moses and Elijah. Moses represents the law. Elijah represents the prophet. Now here's what's interesting. God refers to them as witnesses. So the law and the prophets will bear witness that Jesus was and is the Messiah. And if you remember when I was teaching on this, I told you what they're going to do. They're going to go to the third temple. I guarantee every time the priest gets ready to make a sacrifice, they're going to be yelling in a loud voice what that represents and how Jesus Christ is symbolized in that sacrifice and offering, and that they need to receive Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And no one's able to kill these two witnesses for 3.5 years. But then they're going to die, and they're going to be taken to heaven after they're resurrected. And we're now at the middle of the tribulation. Have you taken notes? Well, get the DVD, stop it, take your notes on your chart, get it going, stop it again, write it down. I want you to be able to go through the book of Revelation and see the big picture. So now we're at the middle of the tribulation. The seventh trumpet blows. At that point, Daniel tells us that the Antichrist is going to enter into the temple. That is known as the abomination of desolation. When the Jews in Judea see the Antichrist going into the temple and he demands to be worshiped, they are going to flee to the wilderness. The place they're going to flee to, that I believe, is Petra. Petra is not mentioned in the Bible. But if you look at where it's located and the way that it's built, when it says that they flee into the wilderness, this is the only place that they would be protected. And so they're actually, all of the Jews in Judea are going to flee to the wilderness. Now in chapter 12, we're told that a battle takes place in heaven. This is a battle between Michael and his angels and Satan and his angels. And of course, we know the outcome. Satan loses the battle and he's expelled from heaven. And as a result of being expelled from heaven, he knows that his time is short. And so now he's angry. And who does he want to take his wrath out upon? He wants to take his wrath out upon the woman. Why? Because the woman represents Israel. And she's the one who brought forth Jesus. And it's Jesus who's doing all of this. And so now he wants to take his wrath out upon the woman, or Israel. But because the woman's fled to the wilderness, he's unable to harm her. So chapter 12 tells us that he turns his wrath upon her seed, or in other words, the remnant. That's the 144,000. Then we get to chapter 13. In chapter 13, the Antichrist and the false prophet are actually introduced. Now you need to understand that the Antichrist first came on the scene at the very beginning of the tribulation. Remember, I told you when the white horseman, or I should say the rider on the white horse appears, that's the Antichrist. But you also need to understand that the Antichrist does not receive his full power or authority until the middle of the tribulation. See, when he first comes on the scene, there's going to be a group that recognizes him as this great statesman, and he's going to rise to an elevated position, but he does not receive all of his power and authority until the middle of the tribulation. That's why Satan goes and he stands at the sea and he pulls this system up. It's called the beast. It's the Antichrist system, and he pulls this up from the nations, and all of this is given to the Antichrist. Does that make sense? Now, I told you that I personally believe that the Antichrist is going to be what the Islamic believers term as al-Mahdi. That's who they're looking for. When the Antichrist comes on the scene, he's going to fulfill everything that Muslims are looking for in their Messiah. And that's also when, at the middle of the tribulation, that the false prophet comes on the scene. His job is to get people to take the mark of the beast and to worship an image that he sets up of the beast. And anyone who does not take the mark of the beast, number one, they can't buy or sell. Now, if you can't buy or sell, why would you work? You won't be able to work. You'll be out of a job. You won't be able to buy anything. You won't be able to sell anything. And this is a way that they're able to put pressure. And this system, the beast system, is known also as Babylon. And that's why he's so upset. God is upset, as we saw in chapter 14, with Babylon, because it coerced people by putting them out of a job, by not allowing them to buy or sell. You have to take the mark. And when you take the mark, you need to also worship the image of the beast. If you don't, you're going to be put to death. And that brings us to chapter 14. Now, in verses 1 through 5, in chapter 14, we saw the 144,000 in heaven singing a new song. Now, why do we see them in heaven? Because they've been martyred. See, we're at the middle of the tribulation. The mark of the beast is here. Now you have to worship the image of the beast. The 144,000 are not going to be. In fact, it's kind of interesting. We call it the Shema, but it's the Israelites or the Jews, actually pronounced the Shema. They are always quoting, "The Lord our God, our Lord is one God." And what's kind of interesting about this, as they continue on, they get to a part where they say, "We will love him," or "We are to love him with all our heart, soul, and strength," right? But what's kind of interesting is, during this time of persecution, they're going to do what Jews have done in the past. When they would get to this part and they were going to be persecuted and martyred, they would say, "With all our heart, our strength," and then they would say, "our soul, even when we give our soul." And that's what they would say right before they die. And we're going to see that take place with the 144,000. They're going to be martyred. And the reason they did, of course, as what I've already explained. Now, after the vision of the 144,000 in heaven, John sees 3 angels that are flying across the sky, one after another. And they're all making dramatic and climactic announcements. Each announcement is a proleptic statement. Now, remember what proleptic means. Proleptic means to acknowledge a future event as if it's already happened. So, in a sense, a proleptic statement is a preview of what's to come. So verses 6 through 20 are a preview of what's to come in the next few chapters. And I gave you examples, and we need to see those again. The first angel proclaims that the hour of God's judgment has finally come. And sure enough, in chapters 15 and 16, we see that through the 7 vials. Each time one of the angels pours out a vial, that is the wrath of God, and it comes upon the world. The second angel proclaims that Babylon has fallen. That doesn't happen until chapter 18, verse 2. That's when we see the fall of Babylon, but it does fall. And then the third angel proclaims that those who take the mark and worship the image of the beast, they are going to be eternally damned. And we don't see that, I'll be honest with you, until we get to chapter 20, but it does take place. And of course, verses 14 through 20, which we're going to study next week, actually is a preview of the Battle of Armageddon. So we see, in a sense, in the 14th chapter, an outline of the final 3.5 years of the tribulation. This is what's going to happen right before Jesus appears and then when he appears. But tonight, all I wanted to do, because we've gone so far in depth, verse by verse, is for you to see that actually, in one short period, I can go completely through the book of Revelation. And that's what I want you to see with this chart. So hopefully, if you can't remember all of these things and write them down on your chart, get the DVD. Stop the DVD, start taking notes. But here's what's interesting. You'll literally be able to go through the book of Revelation, and in about 15 minutes, you can actually go through this, look at this, and go all the way through it. And if you do that every once in a while, you have mastered the book of Revelation. So as I said, after we finish the 7 vials in 2 or 3 months, I'm going to do this again. I'll try to announce it ahead of time for those of you who don't like reviews, so you can stay home if you want. But you really need to hear this over and over again for you to go, I'm getting this. You're right. This is not that difficult.